wants to paint some lavender with me? This doesn't have to be overly difficult. I'll break it down into simple steps and enjoy. These are the materials I'll be using for today's painting. You can pause the video and refer to the video description for a full list of these materials. These are the paint colors I'll be using for today's floral. You can pause the video and refer to the video description for these exact colors. Otherwise, just use what you have and get somewhere close. Also in the video description is a line drawing as well as a reference photo that you can download for free. Just print the line drawing at home, and on the back of your line drawing, you can apply graphite and then position it on your watercolor paper. Tape it in position and trace the line drawing using a ballpoint pen. Just with the pressure of your pen, you're going to be able to push the graphite from the back of your line drawing onto your watercolor paper, essentially drawing the subject for you. You're also welcome to freehand. Once you have completed transferring your flowers line drawing, I want us to begin with applying masking fluid to a few select areas. However, I always want to make sure that the pencil lines from my transfer are not so dark that they might show through some of the lighter values of paint color. So I'm just going to go through and use a kneaded eraser to lightly tap the top surface of some of these pencil lines just to soften them up. Where I have pencil lines in darker areas of color, I'm not so much worried about. So I'm really just focusing on some of the lavender blossoms that are more of a soft pastel. And anywhere where I might have some lighter values up against the background. Once I've softened some of the lines that I feel like are kind of essential, I'm now going to use a small number 2 round to apply some masking fluid to maintain some of my bright whites. This is the masking fluid I'm going to be using today. There's many brands, but I do like to protect my tools by using a small amount of dish soap in some water. And I just coat my brush with that soapy water before dipping in this masking fluid. I plan on doing a loose, soft background with very subtle pastel color tones. But there are some bright whites that I would like to maintain on parts of this floral. So I'm just going through and keeping my brush held vertical and using very gentle light pressure. I'm just applying a few thin wispy lines in some areas where I want to maintain some of those bright whites. After I've gone a short distance of adding some masking fluid to a few select areas, I am going to take a moment to re-rinse my brush just to ensure that the masking fluid doesn't have a chance to dry on the bristles and ruin my brush. So I re-rinse in that soapy water and then continue to apply my masking fluid. I am going to apply some masking fluid in a thin, narrow line along the left edge of the stem. trying to keep my stem as consistent as I can. Sometimes I see little fuzzy like hairs on a flower, and if the flower is backlit, a lot of times those are lighter in value. So by doing just a small series of little dots to kind of indicate where those fuzzes might be, it just adds an extra layer of details. Whenever I'm applying these thin wispy whites, I hold my brush much lighter than I would a pencil. That way I'm barely grazing the top of the surface of my paper using my paintbrush. I keep the pressure feather light, and that allows me to get these really small, delicate shapes for where I want my masking fluid to be. I don't want to apply the same pressure I would with a note or pencil, because then my lines would all be really wide. Applying the masking fluid and really taking our time with it is one of the more important steps. It's not something we want to rush. I try to tell my students that it's equally as important as the paint, so don't rush it. You're welcome to fast forward the video to where you can see where I've applied my masking fluid, and then just pause it on that screen. That way it kind of goes a little faster. In the central areas of this lavender, in some of the blossoms, there is some yellow that I want to capture. Yellow is often dulled by any sort of purple or green. So I'm going to take an extra step to mask that yellow so that I don't accidentally dull it with a different color. I have a very strong light source from the left side. So many of the blossoms along the left are going to have some bright whites kind of showing. I'm going to re-rinse the masking fluid out of my brush just to protect my tools, and then I'll return to my masking fluid. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. All right, I'm going to let that masking fluid dry. I've rinsed the masking fluid out of my brush really well. I'm now going to rinse that soapy water out of my brush. Soapy water and the paint is not super helpful. I'm going to now use my number 10 round to mix up some paint colors to use in the background. My background colors I do not want to be too vibrant, so I am going to use a little more water just to dilute the colors so they're a very mild, soft pastel. So one of the colors I'm going to use is going to be a permanent rose. Another color I plan on using is a purple lake. I'm also going to be using some of that dioxazine purple. And I want to give a hint of some greens in the background also. Now, once I've mixed up my colors, I always like to test the values. To do that, I use a small scrap piece of watercolor paper, and I really make sure to semi-load my brush, so I drag it across the rim to remove the excess paint. And I just do a small little test swab. If my color isn't as dark as I would like, then I need to add more pigment. I need to keep in mind that if I plan on doing this background with the wet and wet technique, that the additional water on the paper will dilute my color. So I need to mix my color slightly darker than my end goal. Once I'm happy with my color values, I can set that scrap piece of paper aside. And I am going to mix up a very small amount of the Ultramarine blue. This is a granulating pigment in this particular brand, and I just want something that's ever so faint, but I do want to have enough of it to cover this background. Since I'm painting on a small scale, little 5x7, it won't take too much paint. All right, so I've rinsed all the paint out of my brush. I'm now going to use a number 10 brush to just completely cover this entire page with clean water. Since I'm working on a watercolor block, it helps minimize the large wrinkles and buckling of the paper. First initial layer of water will be absorbed into the paper rather quickly. So I take my time to kind of continue to move the water around on the surface to resaturate areas that might be drying a little faster than others. This also ensures that we kind of even out the sizing compound that's on the top of the paper surface. The sizing compound is a clear liquid that the manufacturers apply to the paper, and it helps kind of provide a layer of protection between the paper and your paint, making it easier for your paints to move and lift, giving you more flexibility. Papers without sizing compound can be more difficult to work with and not as flexible. Okay, so everything is saturated, but notice how I don't have any puddles, okay? It's a nice even amount of water. And knowing that it is thin and beginning to absorb into the paper will ensure that I have control over where my paint goes. If your water is too thick, then unfortunately your paint will go all over. You won't have any control over your shapes, and it will cause frustration. If you don't have enough water, then unfortunately you're going to get a lot of brush strokes and you're not going to get that soft blurred effect that we want in the background. So I'm first going to start with the ultramarine blue. Now I am going to choose to add this ultramarine blue to most of the background behind my forward subject. The reason for this is adding just a small hint of blue kind of helps push your background and makes it recede, helping with the focal point so things don't completely blend in with one another. And because I have the right amount of moisture on my paper, my paint is relatively staying in the area that I put it, and it's not floating into spaces where I don't want it. So once I have just kind of this soft layer of blue, I'm now going to get some of my greens, and I want to just kind of give a hint of some greens behind my flower. And I want to kind of create these interesting shapes in my background so it adds interest. Once I have my greens in, I'm going to rinse my brush and grab some of my soft pinks. Pink and green will get kind of dingy if you overlap them and mix them on your paper. So I'm okay with having them near one another and side by side, but I try to minimize overlapping them too much because then I get a lot of neutral gray tones. I want some soft pinks kind of behind parts of my blossom. So I'm trying to kind of go around it. If it mixes with parts of the blossom, I'm not going to stress too much about it. Purples and pinks kind of layer really beautifully. If there's paint kind of creeping into areas where you don't want it, you can use a clean, dry brush to help absorb and soak up some of the paint and remove it from spaces. I just press down with firm pressure using a clean, dry brush, and it will soak up some of the paint out of some of those areas, giving you a little more control. But I do need to move quickly because things are beginning to dry. I'm going to grab some of that Purple Lake color, giving a hint of maybe some blurred lavender blossoms behind the main focal point. Notice how I'm allowing some of that texture. So try not to kind of blend that all away. Rinsing all of that paint out of my brush. Anytime I rinse, I re-dry my brush on my sponge just so I don't dilute my colors. I'm now going to that darker purple. And I'm just doing a few dots here and there, trying to vary their shapes and sizes. Again, if there's any paint creeping into areas where you don't want it, clean your brush and dry it off, and then use your brush with firm pressure to help kind of soak up some of that color. You can also use a paper towel and press down on areas you want to remove paint and color, but that will sometimes leave a texture behind depending on your technique. So just depends on your personal preference. But be okay with your painting looking like a painting. If they're at this point, I have some areas that are glossy and some areas that are no longer glossy, which means I'm at this stage where if I continue to fiddle, I'm going to create blooms. But if you know how to use blooms to your advantage, you can actually use them to bring highlights back into your background. So if I use a small #2 brush with clean water, if there's an area where I want less paint and I want to kind of push the color out, I can drop in some clean water, and essentially that clean water will create a bloom and it'll push the pigment out of that zone. And it just kind of helps me create little highlights in areas where I might be losing them. I can also use this technique to just bring in some interest into the background. So if I just dab small little dots of water in areas that are beginning to dry with the goal of lightening up the color in that area, it'll bring some fun texture and happy accidents and add a little interest to what otherwise might be a little boring. So I'm just doing small little dots of water here and there, being selective and intentional with where I apply them. All right, I feel pretty good about this. I'm going to give this some time so the blooms can kind of react, and then I'm going to hit it with the blow dryer to move on to the next step. Now that everything is completely dry, I am going to begin painting the blossoms. I'm going to start off with some of the actual blooming portions of the blossom. I'm using the watered down permanent rose. So a very light color, nothing too drastic. And since many of these are smaller shapes, I feel comfortable coming in and just painting wet on dry. I can occasionally bring in some water just to kind of smooth out the paint for a softer look. And it also allows me to cover this space a little more quickly and without brush strokes. So I haven't removed the masking fluid yet. I'm going to continue with this color to add a little bit to some of these side blossoms. However, the blossoms along the left edge are up against that light source. So I'm really focusing on kind of the base of the blossom that is more in shadow, because the blossom itself that is facing our light source is going to be much lighter in color. So I will be using a even softer pink in those areas. Since none of these blossoms are really in contact with one another, I can paint them all at once and they're not just going to bleed into each other and make a mess. I'm going to take a moment to mix up a soft purple. This purple is with Purple Lake and just a little bit of that Dioxazine purple. And essentially, I'm going to hop around this painting and just do one bud at a time. So I'm providing that Purple Lake base color into this whole little blossom here, or bud. And then while it is still glossy and wet, I'm going to grab that darker Dioxazine purple, and on the central area and right edge where the color is much darker in value, I'm going to just add a little bit of that darker purple for contrast, trying to make sure that my values are distinctly different. I now need to find another blossom that is not in contact with where I just painted. I'm using that soft Purple Lake. Just filling in that whole little blossom, and then I'm going to return to my dark purple, and in the areas where I see some shadow, I'm going to darken things up. This is a process I'm going to repeat on many of these little buds. So find a bud that isn't in contact with an area that is currently still drying. Add the Purple Lake. Find where your shadows are and add some shadows. Fill it with Purple Lake. Make sure there's no puddling of paint. Then get your darker purple and add your shadow. As long as your paint isn't overloaded, or as long as your brush isn't overloaded with paint, you should be able to kind of control where your shadow color goes. If you have too much puddling, it makes it very difficult. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Sometimes the blossoms or buds that are near our light source might be lighter in color. So if you want to, you can use that soft pink for the base color instead of that Purple Lake. just to give a little bit of a softer tone. Once you have that soft pink in, then you can return to establishing your shadows. On the right edge where we are more in shadow, you could also use some of that watered down ultramarine blue for your base color to give a little bit more of a blue tint. Just continue to be mindful of where your paper is wet and avoid working side by side until things are completely dry in that zone. This is a lot of just repeating the same steps, hopping around to paint one blossom at a time, just watching for the colors and values and changing as necessary. But since these steps are so repetitive, I'm not talking too much, and I hope that's okay for you all. I always make sure to soak up puddles of any paint before I introduce an additional color into that little bud, because that will ensure that I have control over where my paint colors are going. If you let your paint puddle, it's very challenging to control that. Sometimes, depending on where your masking fluid is, the masking fluid can create a nice little barrier between some of the buds, allowing you to paint different colors side by side without everything becoming blended together. Being mindful of where your paper's wet is really important, so do pause once in a while. Make sure you're looking at your reference photo to help guide you of what color to use where. A lot of times I'll use my finger for my non-dominant hand to point to the area I'm working at as I paint it. That way I don't get lost, especially as I start moving towards more complicated subjects. Having that non-dominant pointer finger kind of resting in the area where I am painting on my reference photo, it just kind of helps give me confidence that I know where I'm at and I don't just go on autopilot. I'm also being mindful of the colors that are directly behind my blossoms. I don't want everything to just completely camouflage into one another. So if I find that the blossom color is very similar in value to the background color nearby, I typically change the value to be either darker or lighter to give it more contrast. There's a hint of a little blossom that's in the background, so that's why it's such a weird shape. Since I'm keeping my paint colors thin and I'm not allowing the puddling, my paints are drying very quickly on the paper surface, which allows me to be pretty proficient and fast at painting these little buds. Try to be mindful of where your stems are so you don't accidentally paint over them. I'm going to use the really soft pink to fill in some of the remaining blossoms that I haven't been able to get to yet, or the little bloomed flowers, I should say. And on them as well, I'm mindful of similar values and tapping in some additional color just to make it stand out if I need to. When it comes to the little flower blooms on the far left edge, I really make sure to water down my color quite a bit so that it is really faint and soft. I'm starting to reach a point where I'm running out of the little flower buds to paint. Once I have the main buds kind of filled in, I can then change my focus to the stem, continuing to paint wet on dry. And I might add just the tiniest bit of pink to this green, just so it looks more like an olive and gets a little darker in color. Now, every element in this lavender has at least a first layer of paint, but there are some areas where my buds are very similar in value, so I need to add a second layer to bump up the contrast. So for example, these two buds here are very similar in value. So I'm going to personally choose to add some selective dark shadows on just one of the buds in the background so that they stand out from one another. Now once I get that shadow layer in, I can dry my brush on a sponge, and then once I have a dry brush, I can use that to kind of feather and blend the edge of the shadow. So I'm going to repeatedly use this technique to kind of help build the contrast on some of these little buds. So just to cover how to do that again, I've got a dark purple on my brush. I'm going into an area where I feel like the color should be a little darker, and I'm just doing a layer right on top. Sometimes the shadow has a hard edge, so I don't feel like I need to blend anything, and sometimes the shadow has a very soft edge, and in order to feather that to blend in with the rest, I just dry my brush and blend with the dry brush while it's still damp. So this is how I push my contrast just to make sure that these elements really pop forward. Dry brush to help blend. I could even add a little bit more dark blue to my dark purple just to push the color darker yet. And again, some of the darks have a hard edge, and sometimes it's soft. So I'm just paying attention to what my eyes are seeing in my reference photo. So on these little lavender buds, there is a bit of texture, and sometimes that texture creates kind of this recessed area of the bud that's a little darker. So I can kind of do these really subtle, delicate dots that are following the contour of the bud, creating some of that detail. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Again, use your finger to kind of keep track of where you're at, if it's going to help you feel confident in not losing your place when it comes to these finishing details. But be patient with building the layers. That's what half of watercolor is. It's just patience and doing layer upon layer to get the details, building up to those real darks. Sometimes the texture on the buds is a different color due to the light source. So just because the texture on the bud is a real dark purple on some doesn't mean we need to do that for everything. So vary your colors in your shadows. That will help as well. I want to try and make sure that I have a lot of these darks and additional details done for the most part before I remove my masking fluid. And once we remove our masking fluid, it is going to kind of bring to light some additional fixes we need to do. And you'll soon discover whether or not we need more practice with masking fluid. It's a love or hate relationship with this stuff. I'm going to get some of that darker pink because the little base of each little flower bloom should be a little darker than the bloom itself because of the shadow that it's creating. So I'm just going through and darkening that up. I'm going to continue to use this darker pink just to add some of the details within these little flower blooms. Our brain loves symmetry and even spacing. But if we really take our time to look with our eyes, we're going to find that in nature, it isn't always even and symmetrical. So give your eyes time to really look at the variation of lengths in your line work and try to add those variations into your painting. This blossom in the upper right has some petals that are foreshortened just because of the angle it's at. So I'm just doing a little bit of a second layer on those forward facing petals. Now, if in the process of adding some of these pink textures to your petals, you feel like some of them need to be softened, just take a damp brush with some water to the surface of the line, and you can move that damp brush around just to soften the appearance of some of these lines so it's not so hard. I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer so I can remove the masking fluid and see where I'm at. Now that the masking fluid is completely dry as well as the paint, I'm going to use my rubber cement pickup. You could just use your fingers, but I am going to remove all of the masking fluid, and this is where we discover whether or not we did good with the masking fluid or we need to do some touch-ups. I usually always have some sort of touch-ups to do, but I do think it's important to maintain some of those bright whites. It really helps, I think, with the finished product. So you can kind of see already how much those little whites help make the flower kind of pop forward from the background. It just kind of brings it to a whole new level. So maintaining those little bright whites, I think, is really essential to paintings. Now, if there's any areas where I'm kind of unhappy with it and I feel like it needs touch up, now's the time to do it. A lot of times I find that I can just take a wet brush into an area of dry paint and I can kind of soften the edge of where I lifted some masking fluid so it looks a little bit more intentional. But my goal is not to cover up the bright whites. I just want to find a few areas where maybe I feel like it's a little too harsh of a white and it needs maybe just a subtle tint. But it doesn't happen everywhere. So some areas I'm just tinting the white using my damp brush and kind of dragging some of the nearby color into the area of white that the masking fluid left. In other areas, I might choose to add paint just to thin out a wide white line that was perhaps unintentional. But some of these bright whites, I think, add an element to the painting, so I don't want to completely tint all of them. For the left edge of my stem, I would like to have just a more subtle lime green, so just a little bit of yellow. So I'm just going along that left edge of that stem with a lime green. It is mostly yellow, to add a little tint of color. I also want to mix up some cadmium yellow for the center of some of the flowers. I use very little water because I do want this to be a darker yellow. And I'm just going to find some of the centers of the blooms. I can't work on those flowers if the yellow is still wet, so I need to give them some space. I'm going to darken up my blue. So it's definitely darker. And if there's a few little buds that I feel like need a glaze just to kind of make them pop a little bit more, I can do that while the center of those little flowers are drying. Sometimes the colors just aren't as dark as we would like, and I don't want things camouflaging into one another. I'm just continuing to pay attention to contrast. If I feel like there's certain buds that are all just blending together, I add a glaze of darker color on just part of one of the nearby buds just to make them stand out a bit more. Once the center of your little flower blooms has completely dried, you can come back in with just some subtle glazes. I'm going to use that purple lake, but I'm going to make sure it's really watered down. And if I want to add some definition between some of those petals, I can just do a really soft glaze. So this is barely any color at all, and it still makes a big difference. So if you want to see the value of my color, this is how dark it is. Very, very watered down. But I can use this glaze to just selectively choose to darken up parts of certain flower petals just to give a little bit more definition. I'm always trying to take my time to really look at my reference photo so I know where I need to adjust. Now, if there's any whites you feel like, whoops, I could have used some whites in this area, that's where this bleed-proof white comes in, or you could use a titanium white gouache. But it's kind of a nice way just to add a couple little splashes of bright whites if you feel like you're missing any. I just take my brush right into the paint and I make sure to just wipe away the excess. I don't know that there's too many bright whites that I feel like I'm missing, but this can kind of help. Could add a little bit of white on the very left edge of that stem if you want. But otherwise, I feel like I'm running out of things to do. I hope you all enjoyed this lavender tutorial and have a fantastic day.